Hi, folks. This is Professor Abundes Guerra. Here we are with some PowerPoint slides. In this video, I want to go ahead and talk about the major ethical theories that are used in ethical debate as well as in ethical arguments. And, just ethical discussions in general. I'm going to try to make this super, super concise. This is a super mini crash course in these ethical theories. There's definitely a lot more to them. But with that said, let's go ahead and get into it. So we're going to go ahead and talk about these ethical theories: deontology, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, care ethics, social contract theories, justice-based theories, critical race theory, animal ethics, as well as environmental ethics. The way I have structured them is roughly from most popular in ethical discussion, ethical debate, ethical arguments, to still popular but less popular as we move down the list. So let me go ahead and shrink my face real quick. We're going to go ahead and start off here with deontology. Deontology is sometimes referred to as Kantian-based ethics. Kant was a German philosopher. Sometimes it's also referred to as duty-based ethics because the idea is to do your duty. Whatever that duty might be, usually is derived by using your rationality. So again, the right thing to do is to abide by that duty. And there's a huge emphasis on the actions themselves are good or bad. So murder itself will be good or bad, regardless of the consequences. And acting on rules that can only be universalized. Kant would eventually go on to call this one of his formulations for the categorical imperatives. He also has an emphasis on treating people with respect, not treating them only as a means or objectifying them. Because people have dignity, people have rationality, we have to respect their goals and ends. Some cons of this is that it can be quite rigid at times. It does ignore outcomes, and it doesn't give us too much guidance when there's conflicting duties. Next up, we have utilitarianism, sometimes called Millian or Bentham ethics after the founders. Here we have a picture of John Stuart Mill. This is a consequentialist-based theory, so the consequences justify the means. And in particular, here we have the greatest happiness principle that says the right thing to do is to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Here we have an emphasis on minimizing harm or pain, as well as maximizing pleasure and benefits. This tends to be great for large groups of people, as well as often for policy making. You often find that a lot of people use it in policy making. There are some cons to this, however. It can sometimes allow for scapegoating or sacrificing minority groups if the larger whole would benefit. It can also sometimes ignore personal rights or duties for the sake of benefiting others, as we mentioned. And finally, it can be very hard to calculate happiness. Next up, we have virtue ethics. That's coming to us from Aristotle, 2000 years ago, an ancient Greek philosopher. And the point with this one here is that it's less about principles and rules, and it's more about developing virtues, good personality traits, and minimizing vices. Vices will be bad personality traits. Again, virtues would be like things such as bravery, ambition, kindness, and vices would be the opposite of that, right? Cowardice, greediness, things of that nature. This emphasizes personal moral development and character. It does allow for some more flexibility in assessing contexts. However, there are also cons. There's going to be cons to every theory here. It can sometimes be too vague. Cultural relativity might be a problem here since virtues, or what counts as virtues, tends to vary. It can also by culture. And finally, it can be a little hard to apply to institutions and systems. What would it mean for, say, a police department or the hospital system, the hospital institution, to be virtuous or kind or generous? What would it mean for them to have that virtue? Next up, we have care ethics. Care ethics is sometimes called feminist ethics or sympathy or compassion-based ethics. This one is a bit newer, and it was originally founded by feminist psychologists in the mid 1900s. And this one still focuses on moral development similar to virtue ethics. Sometimes some people clump them together, but I'm separating them here. But it basically argues that moral development requires carrying attitudes and carrying actions. It does allow for more room for emotion. It places an emphasis on fostering and nurturing real life relationships, which often give rise to weighty obligations. Sometimes it justifies or obligates a certain amount of favoritism. It is also emphasizes being psychologically informed, especially with emotion, especially given that a lot of other philosophical ethical theories sometimes sideline the role emotion plays. The cons of this is that there can be risk of bias or tribalism, where you always benefit people you already have a relationship with. And similar to virtue ethics, it can be hard to apply to systems and institutions, what would mean for a system or institution to be caring or sympathetic or compassionate. Next up, we have social contract theory. This one, as well as the next slide, justice-based theory, are going to be more of social political theories, but they do have pretty huge ethical implications and are used a lot in ethical discussions. Social contract theories are coming to us from the philosophers Hobbes, Locke, as well as Rousseau, which are European philosophers. Sometimes these theories are called contractionism or contractualism. And this is more about what we owe the government and what the government owes us, or these theories try to develop that. They often rely on a hypothetical state of nature where people are not in society, again, hypothetical, and then it goes on to argue how if we were in that situation, we will make a hypothetical agreement or social contract detailing the government-citizen relationship. Again, what they owe us and what we owe them. And what happens if they break that contract? Would we be allowed to revolt, essentially? There's an emphasis again on when we should and should not listen to the government. The cons to this is that it's a hypothetical agreement, it's not a real agreement. And another con is that historically minorities have been excluded from this agreement. The exception to this rule will probably Charles Mills, a philosopher of race, and his famous book, The Racial Contract, which places race at the center of social contract theory. Next up, we have justice-based theories. Here, we're going to go ahead and briefly talk about two, but these focus on how society should be structured and how resources, that is, money, assets, ought to be allocated. First up, we have the very famous Rawlsian theory, or justice as fairness, given in his book, A Theory of Justice. He talks about how people will be pulled into an original position where they have a veil of ignorance before them, and they have to sort of figure out how they're going to structure society without even knowing their place in society, whether they're going to be poor, rich, whatever. He goes on to say that fairness, justice as fairness, requires equal liberty, as well as something he calls the difference principle, which says that inequality, material inequality, is only justified if it benefits the worst off people. So people becoming billionaires or trillionaires is only justified if that actually helps the worst off people in society. This does allow for taxing and redistribution of goods and money. Contrast this to another justice-based theory, entitlement theory from Robert Nozick. This is less about taxes and seeks to create a minimal state with minimal regulation. And basically, in this theory, he argues that we are entitled to the assets we acquire through just acquisition, which pretty much is just anything besides theft. Work, inheritance, gifts, and deals are all things we are entitled to, and essentially taxation is bad, it's theft. This is the cons of this is that it's very abstract. There's a less of a focus on relationships and personal development, um, which is a con. Next up, we have critical race theory. This was actually originally developed by legal theorists, but it does have huge ethical implications, and it is used by social and political philosophers as well as philosophers of race. I myself am quite fond of it. It's made the news somewhat recently, with people sort of rallying against it. But here we have Derek Bell as well as Kimberly Crenshaw. Derek Bell, legal theorist again, argues that racism is a permanent feature of a lot of US institutions, such as hospitals, schooling, and of course the police departments. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality, how different aspects of our identity co-constitute each other and they rely on each other in order to have a full understanding of one's identity. This places an emphasis on the idea that racism is systematic or institutionalized. It's not just an individual thing, but it is embedded in laws, policies, and institutions. Often the law is not neutral according to this type of theory, but it favors dominant groups, often when talking about race, white people, or those deemed as white. Derek Bell gives us the idea of interest convergence. Basically, it argues that advances in racial justice really only happen when they benefit those in power or make them look good or maybe popular or maybe progressive. It also focuses or places an emphasis on counter storytelling, namely how the lived experiences of minorities reveal truth that mainstream media can often ignore. Again, it emphasizes the historical and ongoing impact of past injustice, and it places a huge importance on structural change, not just individual moral development or individual change. There are cons to this. A lot of people accuse it of being a little too pessimistic, and there has been huge political pushbacks. making one question whether the United States would be ready for something like this or ethics based off of this. Next up, we have animal ethics. Popular contenders here, we have Peter Singer as well as Tom Regan. Peter Singer goes with a utilitarian or welfare approach. The idea here is that we're trying to make animals feel as comfortable as possible. We're trying to benefit their welfare as much as possible and not harm them, while Tom Regan argues that they actually have actual rights. Singer himself would go on to coin the term speciesism, which is discrimination against another being simply on account of them being a member or not being a member of a certain species. Reagan uses the famous phrase subjects of a life to argue that just being the subject of life does give you some inherent rights. They both emphasize moral consideration of non-human animals and ending practices like factory farming, unnecessary testing, and exploitation. There are some cons to this, namely that sometimes they can be quite demanding, or they can demand quite big lifestyle changes, such as veganism or policy shifts. There can also be a bit of a conflict of interest between human needs and animal needs, especially when we consider medicine, food security, as well as cultural traditions. Finally, we have environmental ethics here. Popular theorist here we have Aldo Leopold, who comes up with the idea of the land ethic, which is that humans are a member of a community, of a large community, namely nature, and we need to respect that community because we are only one member there. Arne Ness, apologies for mispronouncing that name, comes up with the idea of deep ecology, which is the idea that nature has inherent value independent of humans, completely independent of humans. Things that are emphasized in environmental ethics is the idea of stewardship, namely the idea that humans are here as caretakers of the environment, not as masters, and that we are here to be responsible for and protect the natural world. That can happen with both religious as well as secular versions of environmental ethics. There's also an emphasis often on sustainability, the idea that we need to make policy that is sustainable for the future, not only for ourselves, but for future generations of humans as well. So sometimes we might have obligations to future humans. There are cons to this, of course, is that there's tension with economic growth at times and consumerism. This may also, similar to animal ethics, demand pretty drastic changes to our lifestyle. And it can also sometimes be vague. How do we measure sustainability? Um, do we measure in terms of money or nature or something else? And how do we measure inherent value of nature? But with that said, folks, that was about, I'm not sure how many that was. That was a bunch of major ethical theories that are commonly discussed in ethical discussion and ethical arguments well as debate about one, five, six, about 9 of them, if I'm counting correctly, in about 12 minutes. So I hope this video was insightful and gave you a glimpse into these many ethical theories that have a lot more to them, and you can spend much more time learning about each single one. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video.